And thank you so much for staying with us. You are watching All Angles. I'm Dion Jax Miller. We're joined in this segment of the program by Professor Vereen Shepherd. She is director of the Center of Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies. She's a social historian, and she's also vice chair of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So she brings a number of very interesting perspectives to this discussion about the Maroons and their place in Jamaican society. Prof, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Greetings to all your viewers.
I saw an interesting tweet from you referencing this discussion about the Maroons in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And let me start there because a lot of people were like, how are Maroons indigenous peoples? Because one definition I saw on one of the United Nations pages was describing them as indigenous people, descendants of those who inhabited a country or region when people of different cultures or ethnic origins arrived. So how do the Maroons
Yes,
fit into that context?
yes. They are indigenous peoples because of the fact that indigenous peoples are defined as descendants of the first arrivals or earlier surviving occupants of a land. And really, they are part of 350 to 500 million indigenous peoples in 90 countries of the world. And they are in all regions of the world and occupy some, I would say, I think at the last figure I saw, 22% of global land area. So they represent, the greater part of the world's cultural diversity. And we in Jamaica have indigenous peoples. In fact, I saw, I was looking at the World Directory of Minorities and Indigenous Peoples. And this is what it said under the heading of Jamaica and the subheading Maroons. And I quote, the largest early single exodus of Africans away from slavery came when the British invaded Jamaica in 1655 and expelled the Spanish. A large number of Africans escaped into the hills and mountains and linked up with the indigenous Taino, thereby laying the foundations for the formation of the Maroon settlements. So, in my view, that helps to locate the Maroons of Jamaica within this global community and within the definition of indigenous peoples.
Well, tell me how that changes the conversation then that we have about the place of Maroons. So, for instance, I was looking at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It speaks, for instance, in Article 4 that about indigenous
Yes.
people having the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. And it also says
Yes.
they have the right to their own distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining the right to participate fully, if they so choose,
If
in
they
the
choose.
political,
Yes.
economic, social, and cultural life of the state. So
Yes.
contextualize
Yes.
that for me within the
Yes.
framework of the discussion we're having.
Right. But let me just finish with the issue of the Taino people and their links to the Maroons, because I think this is something that people keep talking about, how they become,
Yes.
indigenous. Now, the word maroon or maroon comes from an Arawakan Taino root. And the word that the Taino people used was Simara, and that was corrupted to Cimarron. And it really signified arrow, the ongoing action of flight of an arrow let loose. And Gabriel Roca analogizes the kind of meaning of Simara to this. He says the intentionality of enslaved or colonized people extricating themselves from conditions of oppression. And they're all over Latin America and actually the Americas. So to address the need to protect, it was to address the need to protect indigenous peoples based on the definition that the United Nations General Assembly made this declaration in September 2007. And I want to stress that 144 states voted in favor, 4 voted against: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. And there were 11 abstentions. But Jamaica was not among any abstention or among those who voted against. So Jamaica is a signatory to this declaration, and that's how it applies to our situation. Now, even the 4 people who had abstained, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US, have since come around to ensure that they actually support and endorse and sign this declaration. So what we're talking about is a declaration that really constitutes the minimum standards for survival, the dignity, and the well-being of indigenous peoples of the world. Now, in 2014, when then Minister of Justice Mark Golding went to Charlestown to an event, I think it was a conference, this is what he said. As a signatory to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Jamaica recognizes the need for the protection of indigenous people whose unique cultures and traditions strengthen the multifarious nature of humanity. End of quote. So, yes, the United Nations saw the necessity of protecting the rights of indigenous people to self-determination, participation in decision-making, respect for and protection of culture, and equality and non-discrimination. Those are the 4 key principles of this declaration. And we have a responsibility to ensure that rather than engage in confrontation, we find a way to settle differences amicably and to respect the rights of people who are saying, we are indigenous, we have rights, you need to respect them.
Okay, we're going to be going back to my interview with Professor Shepherd in a little while, but I wanted to bring in our other guest for a quick comment, Professor Harcourt Fuller, as well as Dr. Marcus Goff. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Goff, let me start with you first and ask you on that issue of indigenous peoples, first of all, since Professor Shepherd was commenting on that, and my phone is blowing up with questions about that as well. So can you add your voice to that issue? Are the Maroons indigenous people?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Dion, for having me on the program. And good evening to all listeners. And good evening to all of my Maroon families and Taino families and others out there, Rastafari families included. So I want to thank Professor Shepherd, of course, for putting it again in an appropriate context. I think that the discussion now today is missing this interpretation, of a modern legal framework. I think we're still harking back to colonial judgment of a pre-constitution chief justice as the source of legal authority, when the pendulum internationally, indigenous rights has shifted, and so as we see, contemporary, after many, many years of fighting for recognition of their rights, indigenous people's rights and tribal people's rights are well established, and I think that the discussion should shift from sovereignty to what are the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples.
I'm going to ask you about sovereignty, but are the Maroons indigenous peoples then, bearing in mind what you just said?
Well, yes, that certainly history that Professor Shepherd espoused, which is the correct history, that the first Maroons were Tainos, right? And that the modern-day Maroons are family, descendants of the Tainos, then they will be entitled to the definition of indigenous peoples that falls under the ILO convention that speaks to the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples. Now, even if we say that they are tribal peoples, the ILO convention says that tribal peoples are peoples whose social, cultural, economic conditions distinguish them from other sections of the national community and whose status is regulated wholly or partially by their own customs or traditions or by special laws or regulations. And so we're saying that the fact that the Parliament of Jamaica may have sought to pass laws to seek to disband the collective identity of the Maroons, despite the fact that there may have been a Chief Justice who passed a racially discriminatory judgment against the Maroons. All of that has now evolved over the last 50 years to today, where we have indigenous and tribal people's rights clearly recognized, and the Maroons of Jamaica, let's say for over 300 years, having governed themselves to this day, certainly would be entitled under contemporary international law.
It's really interesting hearing you say that because, in fact, I was speaking to some colleagues who were saying, hold on, does it mean that we were all taught wrong in school? Because it's as if we learned one history, the Maroons seem to learn another, because almost uniformly Jamaicans are blowing up my phone and speaking and saying, you know, Maroons are not indigenous people. And here we have all these scholars saying, indeed, they are. Prof. Fuller, let me bring you in on this point. What's the significance of that then, that designation to the conversation we're having?
First of all, Happy New Year to my beloved Jamaica from Atlanta, Georgia. Great to see my colleagues, Dr. Goff and Dr. Shepard as well. Let me first say that one of the problems I think we have is misinformation and miseducation, because a lot of the literature that we have about Maroon history is quite frankly wrong and written from a colonial perspective. Quick example is the fact that it is often written that the Taino people had disappeared completely from Jamaica by the time the British took the island from the Spanish in 1655. And that is absolutely wrong. And a lot of what we think we know about the Maroons is based on that false premise. The Taino people lived in the interior of Jamaica because they had been escaping from Spanish enslavement since the 17th century. And then they intermingled with the Africans that had been arriving in said century as well, and subsequently. Archaeological expeditions and studies by the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, for example, have found the material culture and evidence, for example, in the Blue and Jonquil Mountains around the areas of Nanitown and other places that show that the Tainos merged with the intermingled with the Africans who were taken to Jamaica as enslaved people. And so on both fronts, by which I mean the indigenous Taino front and the so-called tribal peoples front, as my colleague Dr. Goff said, the Maroons are a group of people that have rights and privileges and responsibilities for centuries.
Wow. I mean, literally, that is not a conversation I grew up hearing at all. And when we have here the conversation, no, when we have the conversation within the context of the Maroons, as I said, what you hear Jamaican says, but are we seeing an insurrection? Are they trying to say that, you know, they're separate from, and how that work when they still operate within the Jamaican state? What do you think, Prof. Fuller, of the kind of situation we're now in, where people are saying, hold on, are we going to have a standoff? Is this a standoff? Is this a confrontation? What's going on between central government and the Maroons?
First of all, let us remember what our national motto is: out of many, one people. So we are one people with many different faces, with many different groups. We have a variety of ethnic groups that inform and that are a part of the fabric of who we are as a people. And the
Okay.
Maroons are one such particular group with our own lands, with our own language, our own history, and our own leaders. People need to recall that.
Let me ask you
Yes.
to hold there, Prof. Fuller. I can hear you have a lot more to say, and I don't want to hear it, but I need to go to the break, do a little bit of business. We're going to come back with the second part of my interview with Professor Shepard, and then we'll come back to Professor Fuller and Dr. Goff. So stay with us. Remember our hashtag TVJ all angles and our WhatsApp line 3810072. Soon come